February to July of 1922, H.P. Lovecraft published six serialized short stories called Herbert West Re-Animator. It was about an unnamed narrator who idolizes a man named Herbert West, who has a solution that reanimates corpses called reagent. It's very unlike the rest of Lovecraft's work, as they are very small stories about reanimation rather than the bigger stories about unthinkable horror beyond our comprehension and insanity that he's famous for. He even described Herbert West Re-Animator as wretched work, and only did so because he got paid $30 to do these stories. Even many Lovecraftian scholars stated that Herbert West Re-Animator is universally regarded as his worst work. There is only about a handful of adaptations of Lovecraft's work, and most of them take the source material very loosely, are terrible, or are not very well known. Re-Animator manages to take Lovecraft's worst work and manages to make it one of the better adaptations of a Lovecraft story. The first film is regarded as one of the best cult horror films of the 80s, directed by Stuart Gordon, who also directed other Lovecraft adaptations like From Beyond, Castle Freak, Dagon, and the Masters of Horror episode Dreams in the Witch House. It adapts the first two serialized stories, From the Dark and The Plague Demon, more accurately than you might think, with the exception of the change to contemporary times and some other subplots. But we're here to talk about the sequel, not the original, so let's get into it. Bride of Re-Animator takes place 8 months after the first film, with Dan and Herbert in Peru trying to improve the reagent while on tour as medics during a civil war. They come back home and West tries to various ways to improve his reagent, coming to the conclusion that he must create life rather than just bring it back. While it is definitely not as good as the first film, it's still a rather good film, contrary to what a lot of people think. Both Combs and Abbott return to their roles, and both do a magnificent job. In terms of differences to the first, it feels more like a continuation with West learning from his mistakes and trying to improve the reagent, but still retaining the oversized ego and confidence. Kane is still being strung along by West through manipulation of getting Meg back, but is still the likable, relatable tethered to the film to West's insane personality. While the original film is light on the Frankenstein homages, but are still there, Bride is heavy on them. It's almost a direct remake of Bride of Frankenstein, down to the bride only coming in at the very end of the film. However, despite this, it's still good. It's definitely heavier on narrative than the first film, as this one has more of a three-act structure despite some pacing and writing issues, as the first film was strung along by the effects through West's experiments and very light on story. Much like the first film, this adapts two of the serialized short stories, this time the final two stories, The Horror from the Shadows and The Tomb Legions, but it changes more things so it could be more like Bride of Frankenstein. However, it still has many of the same story beats and same characters, although slightly changed so that it complements the story better. As a sequel, it continues the story in good and interesting ways, and Combs still steals the show as Herbert West. It just somewhat lacks the heart and weirdness that made the original so good and fun to watch. However, I still recommend it for what it is.